So I want to share a story of how I stole $700,000 of renewals at just 20 years old from a whole bunch of competitors. So back in the day when I was in Australia, I worked for a cybersecurity service provider, or MSSP. I got a client, nothing crazy at the beginning, but ended up building quite a good relationship with him fairly quickly in a large utilities company in Australia. We were talking about various technologies for him to purchase or potentially purchase. And we were strategizing one day in a meeting. He had a whole bunch of renewals that were coming up. They all landed in December. Now, these renewals were a mixture of like firewalls and a whole bunch of other technology, right? They were with our competitors, and I was trying to crack into this account. I spent a whole bunch of time getting to know this guy and figured out pretty quickly that he absolutely loved to get a deal. So I started calling my contacts at these vendors that we had. And I had, decent relationships with some of them and barely any relationship with others, just to get an understanding of kind of the landscape of these renewals that were coming up. For those of you who don't know, one of the most important things in the reseller space is getting deal registration with a vendor. If you sell 100 firewalls to a customer, the next year when the renewal comes around, you have preferred pricing from the vendor. So when you put your margin on that technology, you technically should be 5, 10, 15% cheaper than anyone else who quotes that, because they get a higher quote. And that is to basically reward the reseller for getting the initial deal, bringing the initial lead, so they're protected in the future to maintain their recurring revenue and their recurring margin. So I'm ringing, calling these vendors and trying to get a good understanding of which providers, what's the deal reg protection, all this sort of stuff. So I understand what percentages they have advantage over me. Now, some resellers get greedy. They understand that they're protected in terms of price by 5, 10, 15%, whatever that is. So they'll put extra margin on and see if they can get away with it. They know that some resellers will never put a quote through their systems at 3%, for example. So they can factor in, if they have 5% margins, 8%, and they're going to be on par. So they'll just go at 7, beat you by 1%, keep the renewal, keep the business, keep the relationship, right? So I'm calling around and I get to a vendor who is pretty much the most sizable part of this overall $700,000 deal. And the account executive had left the reseller who got the initial deal, and they couldn't get in contact with anyone. I basically convinced them to take away deal reg, so we had price parity on that portion of the deal. Then I basically manipulated my margins on some of the other technologies to essentially be competitive across the board for the entire deal, not just the 700,000. So I took a hit on one technology with more margin on another. So overall, when you look at it from an entire deal standpoint, I'm very, very competitive. Now, this is at 20 years old. It was quite funny, actually. When the final quote went out with 4 or 5 technologies on it, the client actually called me and said, "Hey, I'm about to sign this contract, give you a purchase order. I just have one question." I said, "What's that?" He said, "How old are you?" And I started laughing exactly like I just did. And he said, I said, "Sorry, how old do you think I am?" And he said 25, and I ended up saying 20. And he was, "What the hell that's insane, crazy. I'm about to spend this much money." Funny, still have a relationship with this guy today. It was kind of my entry into relationship-based selling for sure. But it was a fun story. It was very complex. I had to convince bosses and things on the margin side and get approvals and all this sort of stuff. But very complicated deal, but overall worked out well for us. Now, really the point of this and this message is deal reg doesn't exist in the startup world. Renewals don't exist in the early stage startup world anyway. In the 0 to 1 journey, the only thing that you've really got is obviously the product, but also relationships and building relationships. I work with founders who are looking to tap into the US. That's day to day, all the time. And I think they drastically underestimate the level of commitment and potentially in-person meetings that are required to close these initial deals. I tell customers all the time, the more you can get over here, the better. The more in-person meetings you can get, the better. And building a strategy around, an East Coast tour, a West Coast tour, whatever it might be, is super important. And having someone like ScaleMate on the ground to facilitate that is very helpful.